Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books, where each week we interview an author of a newly published work of nonfiction that we believe is worth your time. The views expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect the views of the University of Texas Brownsville or this station. And now, here is your host, Dr. Bill Strong.
Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books. I'm Dr. W.F. Strong. I'm your host, and we're very lucky indeed today to have a conversation with Philipp Meyer, who is really being lavished with praise from every corner of the publishing world for his new novel, The Sun. This is a Texas saga of Texas-sized dimension. And in addition to being Amazon's Book of the Month, Meyer's novel is being mentioned in the same sentence with McMurtry's Lonesome Dove. And as a literary talent, Meyer is being listed along with Faulkner, Hemingway, Eudora Welty, and other such giants. For me, what matters about this book is not that the Washington Post said it makes a viable claim for the great American novel, and I don't care that the New York Times raved about it or that the Los Angeles Times loved it. This is a Texas novel, so what's important is, what does Texas think? Well, here's what Texas thinks. The Austin Chronicle says it's a vivid, unflinching look at the peoples who struggled to conquer Texas. It is an aerial view of Texas, in which hidden elements of a huge, breathtaking landscape are suddenly made clear. Austin American Statesman said that The Sun is adeptly written. It is rife with conflict. It is richly built on scads of historical data. And the Dallas Observer says, one of the best books I've ever read, incredibly ambitious and rich, and it reminds me of As I Lay Dying. Faulkner and McCarthy fans should definitely read this book. Well, Philip, that's high praise. You must be on cloud nine.
It is nice to hear those things, but you do actually have to process them out of your head pretty quickly because you don't want other people. If you let the praise in, you also let the criticism in. You kind of have to be following your own star, I think, if you're going to be writing books.
Well, I think a lot of people, when they read an author who has made it, so to speak, don't realize the years of wandering in the wilderness to get here. They don't know the dues that you've paid, because you went a long time where you had your doubts that you would ever be published.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I think this is it is funny because people think, oh, here you are, you just kind of come out of nowhere. But meanwhile, I've been writing for 15 years. At night, on weekends, between this job and that job, always trying to squeeze it in, and until finally got a book published.
Well, you've had quite a few interesting jobs in your career. You were a paramedic, right?
Exactly. Yep. At EMT, so I drove the ambulance. The paramedics were the kind of more skilled guys in the back usually. So
you were like Hemingway in that too.
True. Yeah, you got to follow your heroes, I guess.
And then you had, and you worked as a derivatives trader.
Yeah, for a while after college, I worked on Wall Street. I was hoping to make a little money. My parents didn't have that much, so I was hoping to make some money, pay off student loans and all, and just going to get my head above water, I guess. And I left that after a couple of years to take a crack at writing. Mm-hmm. And like you said, it didn't really pan out for a real long time. It was about I quit that job in 2001, and I thought, right now it's 2013. I have my second book coming out. My first one came out in 2009. So it was a solid 8 years of trying real hard and not making it for a long time.
Well, but you had achieved before this particular book. You had high praise for your earlier writing as well. You got the Los Angeles Book Prize, right?
Exactly. Yes.
And this one seems to be a cut above even that.
It does. I hope it is. It took about 5 years to write, between the writing and the research, and I feel proud of it, and I hope it is better than the last book. Hopefully you can always improve. I guess that's the goal in life, really.
What did you learn, just out of curiosity? Did you learn anything about writing, or at least did you learn something about a perspective for writing in your Wall Street work?
Well, I learned about a certain type of person, which was real useful. And it was especially for this Jeannie character, who's an independent oil woman. She's a wildcatter and runs her own show. I think the Wall Street training was invaluable for that, just in terms of how to figure out profit and loss and think about the kind of risks you're going to take in order to be successful, and just the types of people who are successful in business. What is that personality type? And working on Wall Street was very, very helpful for that.
Well, let's talk about the novel itself. I love all things Texas, and my favorite writer in Texas history, or Texas literary history anyway, is Larry McMurtry, as is true for many of us Texans.
Sure.
And this book fits into that genre to me quite well, which is very high praise.
Thank you. Thank you. So, I mean, McMurtry is one of my heroes, absolutely.
And but one of the interesting things here in this book is you rarely see a novel where the main character is 100 years old.
So that was sort of loosely based on Charles Goodnight. Sometimes this is the sort of the nuts and bolts of actually making the narratives work. Just the kind of 5 years of behind the scenes work before the book actually comes out, and you got to do all this figuring. When are the characters going to overlap? How are they going to have conversations you kind of need them to have? And I figured, well, if Goodnight lived to be 93, I can have this guy live to be 100. It's not
yes.
that much more of a stretch.
Yeah, Goodnight factors into so many books. His presence is there in so many Texas histories and novels. His character shows up a lot. I mean, McMurtry worked him in often.
He's just a fascinating character.
Yes,
I mean,
he's
just an amazing guy. I remember reading the Haley biography of him, talking about this is a man who grew up on the plains, was in combat the first 60 years of his life, and he talks about in that biography how he never used a compass once. If he missed a watering hole by 100 yards, he was probably going to die. His horse was going to die, and this guy never once used a compass. He was just dead reckoning and going by his instincts his whole life.
Well, your guy, Eli McCullough, is fascinating because he was kidnapped by Comanches when he was very young, and that fact formulates his personality that makes him so successful later.
Absolutely, and obviously this is a fairly common story. Folks getting taken by Comanches for the whole 50 years of Texas' existence before
Quanah Parker's mother.
Absolutely. And this was a kind of I felt like it was an important story for me to tell. With you got the Texas, the Anglo point of view, a bit of the Mexican point of view, and a bit of the Native American point of view, because that is our history.
Yes.
That is the history. So Eli's taken, and like a lot of folks, he adapts to the tribal living pretty quickly, and then also like a lot of folks, when he's finally forced to return to kind of white society, he has a real hard time, and he ends up holding that time when he was living free, without really anyone to be accountable to, is kind of the best time of his life.
Yes. Well, there's a little bit of Huckleberry Finn in that to me, where I mean, although he's much more violent, but,
sure.
But there's that freedom element where he can't adjust to civilization. He can't go back and be civilized now.
I mean, you read all these old first-hand accounts, and what you find is a lot of the young men in those days would make kind of morbid jokes about how getting captured by the Comanches wouldn't
be so
the worst
bad
thing necessarily. Like you spend all day riding, shooting, and hunting, and which was actually true for a Comanche male in that time.
Well, now, did you get captured by the Comanches? Because you're writing in their language, So how did you learn all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I ended up reading about 350 books, I guess, and I pretty much tried to hunt or at least sleep outside. Walk around a lot and sleep outside every place the book takes place. I did teach myself to bow hunt, and tan hides. I'd always hunt a little bit, but never really that seriously. Took a bunch of classes on animal tracking, just to get a real feel of how folks lived back in the frontier times. Because I think the problem with a lot of these history books on Texas is they're all written by academics. So and to really understand life in those days, I think as a writer, you at least have to have some rough grasp of it. So I went, I've got all these old antique pistols and the reproductions of all those old black powder guns. Figured them out. I have a Comanche bow that some Comanche friends of mine made for me with dogwood arrow shafts, and figuring out how to shoot that was fairly difficult. And I tried to at least get a basic set of understanding of every kind of skill folks needed back in those days.
Well, I have great respect for Quanah Parker, as a survivor, because he was never defeated in battle.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at this guy, and he was leading the Comanches. I mean, he was about 25 years old, I believe. I mean, he was quite a young man.
Yes.
When the kind of major points of his life were happening.
And then when he finally resigned himself to change, that he had to change with the changing world, he changed his clothes, went to Washington, and became a power broker.
No, he embraced it wholeheartedly. I mean, this is a fascinating character.
Yes,
this is a man who didn't give up until he had to the last possible minute, and then he embraced that change. He wasn't stuck in the past, which is pretty fascinating.
Well, the dimension of your book that I particularly like is that you have not sanitized it. These people aren't of the 1850s with a liberal mindset of political correctness. It hasn't been sanitized. They talk and see the world as people at that time would have talked.
Absolutely. I mean, and, a lot of that was also research. I got old books of Bartlett's Dictionary of Slang, I believe, from 1855, and that was a crucial resource for that, just in terms of getting the lingo down. Because I love McMurtry. I've read just about all his books, I think, and but you don't want to be basing your fiction on other people's novels, if that makes sense. You really do want to go back to the source. You want to go back for those first-hand accounts.
I had one thing that hopped out at me, just one word, and I wondered if that was because I could tell that you were being historically accurate to everything, and the language as well, as far as I could tell. And but yet you talked about a woman and a man in bed, and they are spooning. You used the word spooning, and I wondered would they use that word then? Would that be a common term?
I believe now, as I remember, that I saw that term used as related to folks in the Civil War. Men then, even now, Navy SEALs doesn't seem like a manly thing, but when they're cold, they actually do, they spoon, especially in training when they're lying in that water. And the Civil War soldiers did that.
So it's been around a long time.
As far as I understand. But, again, that was one of those things where I'd seen it referred to Civil War soldiers doing that. So.
Well, let's talk about just the theme of the novel so that people understand the beauty of the story and the compelling nature of it, is why they would want to read it. McCullough being 100 years old, but looking back at his life, most of it's just autobiography in a sense, right? That he's telling his story.
Absolutely.
As to how he came to it. Now, what was it about his Comanche background that made him, a ruthless oil man?
Well, I mean, I'll be honest. I don't necessarily see him as being sort of any more or less ruthless than other folks who were. I mean, if we're honest, acquiring land, gaining land back in Texas in those days, or any place on the frontier, did require you to either hire people who knew how to use their guns or to know how to use it yourself. And so, to me, this just felt like a historical type. So I have heard other people describe him as ruthless. I guess I was just trying to be accurate and not. What you were saying about having these characters have abnormally liberal mindsets or something. I did not want to do that. I did not want to make him a kind of action figure hero in a way that he wouldn't have actually
been. Yes. So, well, it reminded me a little bit of, the old television series Dallas, where Jacques, who's the patriarch, is explaining to Bobby, who's kind of weak-willed. He tells him that power is not something somebody gives you; it's something you take.
Absolutely.
And so this fits into what McCullough's value system is that he's seen how little, I guess you might say, the justice gets its own way just because it should, that it has to have the force of arms behind it often.
And that is the unfortunate case when you look at human history. You look at the various the various Native American tribes took this land from each other back and forth for 10, 15,000 years. I mean, just in the time that the Spanish were around to write it down. You had the Apaches come in and wipe out most of the tribes in the western part of the state. They left the Karankawa and the Tonkawa and the Caddo in place, but everyone west of that pretty much got wiped out. And then 100 years later, the Comanches come in and do exactly the same thing to the Apaches and drive them out. And then, you can almost just look at it as a bigger tribe of folks, meaning Americans, came in and wiped out the Native Americans, the Indians. So I think if you look at human history, it is just when one group gets power, they tend to covet the resources of another group, and they tend to take it by force.
I like that let me see, I guess it's Eli's Comanche father, his stepfather, if you want to call him that. Toshaway, is that his name?
Exactly, Toshaway, yeah.
Toshaway. And I love his little speech, his little monologue where he's explaining to Eli that just what you said, that the Indians took it from other Indians, took it to other Indians, and now the whites are trying to take it from them. I loved his line where he said he was always mystified that white people were surprised when he killed them. That's a great line.
Well, it is. It's that funny split you had on the frontier where you did have people like the original Parker family, and who had a fortified compound, but never closed the doors, who didn't plow their fields with their guns close by, and the result was they got attacked, and half of them got butchered. But because they knew they were on Comanche land. I mean, there's no. I guess they might have thought that God was going to protect them, or that this is something that the universe wanted for them to have. But I think when you read a lot of other settler accounts, everyone knew that they were taking over land that other people had a claim to, and they just decided they had a more legitimate claim, and they kept their they were out plowing their fields and raising their stock, but they kept their guns close at hand. They knew it was they were kind of moving into a combat zone, and I think it's sort of interesting when you read those accounts of the sort of naive type who goes out there thinking that they're going to be watched over somehow, and then the folks who were more likely to live who kind of had a more clear sense that they were taking the land from someone else, but that was fine because that was what they were going to do.
Well, there was that attitude again of it. I'm taking the land, but I'm taking it from Mexicans, or I'm taking it from Indians. So,
and sure, this is what we all do. This is what the Europeans did to each other. The French and Germans fighting over parts of that country. This is just what
the history of the world.
It's the history of the world, and it's. I think we sometimes think America is sort of somehow accepted from that history or immune from it, because maybe we don't like to think about it that much, but we're not. We in many ways we are, like every other humans who ever lived.
I want to know how a boy from Baltimore writes so authentically about Texas. That's the only thing that bothers me here. Is here you've written one of the great Texas novels, but you're not from Texas.
Well, I basically fell with the state. I came down here for graduate school, and I didn't know what to make of it coming in. And then within really a couple months, I kind of thought of it as my adopted home. You guys all have, you have your Texas history classes. In middle school, I guess, and then in college, I took some in graduate school. And the more I learned about the state, the more fascinated I became about it. And it occurred to me very early on, right before I finished my first published novel, American Rust, that the next book was going to be about Texas, and that I had an enormous amount of work ahead of me because I really had to learn the history. So I was pretty intimidated for a while, and I was worried about what people. Well, I told them I was writing a novel about Texas, but I've grown up in Baltimore, what they were going to say. But to be honest, everyone was so friendly and supportive, and people went out of their way to help me and give me information about their families, and it was a very warm, pleasant experience overall.
Well, maybe you're kind of represented that bumper sticker of, I wasn't born in Texas, but I got here as fast as I could.
There's no question. Absolutely.
And, there's been a lot of writers who have written brilliantly about other places because they're not of them originally. They see more clearly.
To me, this is very helpful. I cannot imagine writing about the place I grew up because it's very difficult to see those things honestly, how you're mixing up, you don't know what memory is true, what's not, your sort of sentimental feelings about something interfere with your ability to see it clearly. I feel much more comfortable writing about places that I come into as a kind of an outsider. My first book was set in Pennsylvania, where I did not grow up there, and it's a lot more work. It's a heck of a lot more work to do all the research, but it's just a way I feel more comfortable working.
Well, if you read 300 books on Texas history, you know far more Texas history than 99.9% of Texans.
Well,
because most Texans know legend.
Sure.
And that's another thing good about your book is you come in and you straighten out a lot of these historical misconceptions.
I sure tried, and and a lot of that, if I did do that, it was because I was not reading a bunch of other westerns as I was writing this book. I really was going back to the source material.
I think one thing you demonstrate quite clearly is that many of the people in Texas who are part of the let's secede mentality, they have the belief that Texas has always been rich. And
this is absolutely those years of independence were hard years. There was no money.
Yes.
Everyone was poor. You couldn't even use a horse as currency because the Indians would steal your horses, and people were using cows as dollar bills back then. It was not a time. I think people look back on it now as being an ideal time. But when you read everyone who was alive then, living through those days, they were all very, very happy when Texas joined the U.S.
Yes.
No one was because everyone, like you said, everyone was poor. There were no roads. There were no schools. And joining America was what made Texas. To be honest, it is what made Texas what it is today.
Absolutely, because they were fearful not only of the Indians; they needed the protection from the Indians, but they also needed protection from Santa Anna, who kept rattling the saber and threatening to come back.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that whole question of whether Texas was going to end up going back to Mexico, that was wide open up until the wars in 1848. Absolutely, that was a wide open question. We don't think about that now, but that was again, when you read the literature, no one who lived through those days was particularly the thought of going back to them didn't make them happy.
Well, I want to talk about the Comanches as a culture, because one thing I think that you point out in your book is that the Comanches were no real great force until they got the horse.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's interesting. We think maybe the Blackfeet, who've been armed by the French, they kind of pushed west across the northern part of the U.S. They run into the Shoshone, who then split off into the Shoshone who remained up in Wyoming and the Comanche who come south. And until they picked up the horse from the Spanish, they were the sort of poorest, most downtrodden, starving of tribes. But they did something that none of the other tribes did, which is they mastered the horse. They learned to fight from horseback, which was very unusual. And it wasn't really wasn't till the Texas Rangers and guys like Coffee Hayes copied the Comanche way of warfare that we were, we meaning Anglos, had any chance of beating them in battle. But again, it was the strange thing was it was actually us learning from them rather than the other way around. Even though they'd gotten the horse from modern Europeans, they learned to use it in a way that no one else had.
They were just magical at stealing horses, weren't they?
No, they were. I mean, there's in all these old books, Jenkins' book Recollections of Early Texas, he talks about you could have the reins in your hand as you fell asleep, wrap them around your wrist, and you would wake up, your horse would be gone, and they would have cut the reins so quietly that you slept right through it. And this was a very common occurrence.
So they were really a culture of horse whisperers. They all were one with the horse.
Absolutely. I mean, and this is something that the earliest accounts of Anglos talking about watching the Comanches ride. These are hard men, who were in the cavalry, in the army, who'd ridden out, into the middle of Texas, fairly dangerous place, obviously, and watching these Comanches ride, they said it was like nothing they'd ever seen before.
Well, you have essentially three stories here, or three characters telling their stories. You have Eli, the 100-year-old patriarch of the family, and then his son Peter, who is somewhat the liberal of the bunch, at least feels a little guilty about things.
Yeah.
And then his great-granddaughter, who's more like the colonel, who is the patriarch.
Absolutely.
And she's the tough as nails oil woman.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, yes, you basically, as I originally wrote the book, it was just Peter and Jean Ann. It was really a story about oil and discovering oil. And but the further I get into it, the more I realize that if I was really going to kind of tackle the kind of larger question of what do we come from as Americans and also as Texans, that I had to go back much further in history, and the book had to encompass at least most of the 19th century. So Eli came in a little bit later. I basically realized you can't just be sort of commenting about, because what I wanted to write about was kind of our mythology, where we come from, how it is we envision ourselves today is always based on our sense of our own history and our past. And in order to do that, I realized I was going to have to engage in a little bit of making that past, or making that kind of mythology, which Eli is. And of course, he's 100, so that's sort of a crazy number to achieve, especially in those days. And he's a sort of a bit of a mythological figure, but I wanted to write about him sort of accurately and sort of humanly as well, because I think sometimes we think of these folks like John Wayne. We don't necessarily think of them as real people, but they certainly were in a lot of ways. They weren't that different from us.
Well, if I were out in the wilderness at risk, I would certainly want Eli McCullough on my side.
Absolutely.
This is a guy who's going to get the job done,
Yeah, for sure.
The other element here that I wanted to to talk about was that this book is naturally, as I was talking to you off the air, it's a book that begs for a movie to be made of it. Although I don't think a movie can do it, it can't be captured. It needs a mini-series.
You're right.
But
I agree with you.
I know you can't really, you're in negotiation or whatever, so you can't really talk about it, but do you think that will happen?
Knock on wood, knock on my own head. Yeah, it's looking about as likely as it can look before the papers are signed. So I think if all continues to go well, we'll be seeing something.
Well, I was thinking of Tommy Lee Jones played, a Texas Ranger in Lonesome Dove, the miniseries, and now he's about old enough to play McCullough. He looks 100.
Amazing. Yeah. But I mean, something we were talking about. We need to get the ink dry on all the papers before we can pick up Tommy Lee Jones. But that would be amazing. I love that. I love that guy.
Well, I know that the book. Your writers often have. By the time the book comes out, you're already into another one deeply. Are you working on another one right now?
I've started to work on something else, but to be honest, this movie stuff or film stuff, miniseries stuff, it's kind of taken over my life a little bit. So that is, I'm guessing that the next novel is going to be put on hold as I kind of work on. If there is a miniseries, theoretically I would be working on it. Put it that way.
So then you'd be like McMurtry. You'd be doing your own screenplay.
Exactly right. And I think if you can do that, you do want to do it because you in terms of now miniseries or a movie, obviously the point of that is not to be perfectly accurate to the book. The point is to capture the spirit or the character of the book. And but when you're the one figuring out what you're going to cut and what's more important, I think the end result's a lot better than if it's some random guy off the street.
Yes. Well, just if you could get me a role in it where I could just be killed, just be shot by somebody, some minor little role.
We'll get your roles at Texas Ranger.
Yeah, there you go. I heard someone recently say that the ideal death would be to be killed by Clint Eastwood and have it narrated by Morgan Freeman. That'd be great, wouldn't it?
Yeah, no, that'd be perfect. I'll see if I can arrange that.
Well, I appreciate it. That'll make my whole life, All right, listen. Thank you so much for joining us. I know that you're on a rocket here. You've got top 10 New York Times. You've got all sorts of accolades coming from every corner, talking movie rights in Hollywood, and I'm grateful you would take the time to talk to us.
No, always happy, WF. Always happy. Thank you.
The book again is The Sun by Philipp Meyer, Amazon's Book of the Month this month. I found it unputdownable. I'm WF Strong for Good Books Radio. Here's hoping that all your books are good reads.